The Oberst stood perfectly erect in the mud. His uniform still held its shape despite 6 days of eating bark soup. Before him, his 147 surviving men dropped their rifles onto a growing pile that squelched with each addition. Their faces were gray. Their eyes sat too deep in their skulls. Friedrich von Schwerin had personally executed 2 deserters that week, both for stealing food from civilians. The Wehrmacht code was absolute. Soldiers endured so the people could survive. The American lieutenant looked impossibly young, maybe 23. He accepted von Schwerin's pistol with a casual nod, then handed it to a sergeant without looking. Von Schwerin had prepared a short statement in English about honorable surrender. He never got to deliver it. "Okay, Sergeant," Lieutenant Morrison said, turning away. "Let's get them fed." Von Schwerin's English was flawless. He was certain he'd misheard. Morrison walked to a 2.5 truck and lowered the tailgate. An American corporal began prying open wooden crates with a bayonet. The lieutenant glanced back at von Schwerin's men. "Jesus, when'd you guys last eat?" Von Schwerin found his voice. "We have sufficient—" "That wasn't the question, Colonel." 6 days. Adequate rations. Morrison's face did something complicated. He turned to the corporal. "Double up the D-rats and get some coffee going." The corporal didn't argue about supply, didn't check a manifest or requisition form, just said, "Yes, sir," and started pulling out more crates. Von Schwerin watched an American private approach his second-in-command, Hauptmann Weber, who stood swaying slightly. The private held out a brown rectangular bar wrapped in wax paper. "Here you go, Captain." Weber took it like it might explode. He looked at von Schwerin. "Permission?" Von Schwerin nodded, numb. The private moved down the line, 1 bar per man. Then he went back for cigarettes. Lucky strikes. 2 packs each. Von Schwerin's logistician brain began calculating automatically. 147 prisoners, 4 ounces per D ration, 588 ounces, 36.75 pounds of chocolate, distributed in, he checked his watch, 4 minutes. Casually, like supply was infinite. Morrison appeared at his elbow, holding out a chocolate bar and cigarettes. "For you too, Colonel. Field kitchen's about an hour behind us. Real food. We'll get you guys sorted before we move you to the stockade." Von Schwerin took the bar. It felt heavier than it should. "You feed prisoners before processing?" Morrison looked genuinely confused. "You guys look like hell." "Yeah, we feed you. Why wouldn't we?" "Because that's not how war works," von Schwerin wanted to say. "Because you ration everything. Because you make the enemy suffer to conserve resources for your own men. Because that's what we did. That's what everyone does." Instead, he said, "This is standard procedure? Geneva Convention, Colonel. POWs get fed." Morrison checked something on a clipboard. "You're 116th Panzer, right? Heard you guys had a rough go the last few weeks." Behind Morrison, American soldiers were sharing coffee from their canteens with German prisoners. Actual coffee. Von Schwerin could smell it from 10 feet away. Not ersatz, not roasted grain, coffee. A young private, couldn't be more than 19, handed his canteen to Weber. "Careful, it's hot." Weber drank. His hand shook. When he lowered the canteen, his eyes were wet. "Danke," he whispered. The private just nodded and moved to the next man. Von Schwerin looked down at the chocolate bar in his palm. The wrapper said, U.S. Army Field Ration D, instructions in English. Approximately 600 calories. 4 ounces that his men would have killed for yesterday. That he would have executed them for stealing from civilians. Now handed out like it was nothing. He thought about the 2 deserters, Schrader and Holst. Schrader was 20. He'd taken half a loaf of bread from a farmhouse. Von Schwerin had shot him personally because discipline had to be maintained. Because soldiers sacrificed so the people could eat. Because that's what separated the Wehrmacht from animals. Schrader died for half a loaf. These Americans were handing out pounds of chocolate and didn't even bother to count it. "Sir?" Morrison was watching him. "You okay?" Von Schwerin realized he was just standing there, staring at the chocolate. He unwrapped it carefully. The bar was divided into squares. The smell hit him first. Sweet, rich, completely alien after years of deprivation. He bit off one square. The taste flooded his mouth. Waxy, intensely sweet. More calories than his last 3 meals combined, dissolving on his tongue. He'd forgotten food could taste like something other than survival. Around him, his men were eating. Some quickly, wolfing down the bars like starving dogs. Others slowly, reverently, making it last. Lieutenant Braun was crying openly as he chewed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. Morrison was talking to his NCO about logistics. Should have the kitchen truck here by 16:30. Get them sorted into groups of 50 for processing. Medical checks first. Some of these guys look pretty rough. What about the officer, sir? Same as the rest. Fed, checked, transported. By the book. The sergeant nodded and walked away, already shouting orders. Von Schwerin finished the chocolate. His stomach cramped immediately. Too rich, too sudden after days of nothing. He didn't care. He opened the Lucky Strikes with fingers that trembled slightly. The American private who distributed them appeared with a Zippo. Light? Thank you. The first drag of American tobacco hit like absolution. Von Schwerin had smoked through the entire war, whatever he could find. Captured Russian tobacco, French cigarettes, the terrible Juno brand the Wehrmacht issued. This was different. This was smooth. This was what tobacco tasted like when the country producing it wasn't running out of everything. He watched another truck pull up. More crates. The Americans were unloading them methodically, efficiently. A portable stove was being set up. Coffee was brewing in a massive pot. One of Morrison's men had found a football somewhere and was teaching a small group of the younger German prisoners how to throw a spiral. A football. They were playing catch with the enemy. Von Schwerin's world view was cracking like ice over a warming river. He'd spent 6 years in this war. He'd seen the Eastern Front. He'd seen what war was. Brutal, total, a zero-sum contest where every resource was precious, and showing mercy meant dying yourself. This wasn't that war. These Americans were fighting like they had enough of everything, like they could afford to waste food on prisoners. Like abundance was their natural state. The terrible mathematics kept running in his head. 147 prisoners in this one group, probably thousands being captured daily across what was left of Germany, all being fed like this, all receiving chocolate and cigarettes and coffee like it was routine administrative procedure. How much supply did that require? How much production? How big was the country that could do this while also fighting Japan across an entire ocean? Morrison came back, checking his clipboard. Okay, Colonel, we've got transportation coming for your men. You'll be processed at the camp in Aachen. Clean bunks, 3 meals a day, medical care for anyone who needs it. 3 meals? Daily, yeah, per Geneva Convention. Your men eat 3 meals daily? Morrison looked at him strangely. Well, yeah, when we're not in the line. You guys weren't getting fed? Von Schwerin almost laughed. We were fed adequately for combat conditions. Which was a lie, and they both knew it. Jesus, Morrison said quietly. He made a note on his clipboard. I'll make sure medical knows you've been on short rations. They'll want to monitor for refeeding syndrome. Von Schwerin didn't know that term. It implied the Americans had encountered this before, implied they had protocols for prisoners who'd been starved, protocols based on having enough medical knowledge and supply to care. The field kitchen truck arrived. The smell of cooking meat hit the Germans like a physical blow. Von Schwerin watched his men's faces. Some looked hungry. Some looked hopeful. Some looked broken by the kindness. Weber appeared at his elbow. Sir, what do? We eat, Hauptmann. We follow their procedures. But sir, we lost, Klaus. This is what losing looks like. Except it wasn't. Losing looked like starvation and summary execution and being worked to death in labor camps. He'd seen it in the East. He knew what victors did to the defeated. This was something else. This was the victors feeding their enemies before even processing them as prisoners. This was having so much that waste was a bigger concern than scarcity. The chocolate bar wrapper was still in his hand. He looked at it again. 4 ounces, 600 calories, mass-produced, designed to be given to soldiers, handed out casually, consumed and forgotten. He'd killed a man over half a loaf of bread. These Americans were complaining about food aging out of their inventory. Von Schwerin folded the wrapper carefully and put it in his breast pocket. Not as a souvenir, as evidence. Proof that what he was experiencing was real. That the world he thought he understood, the world of scarcity and sacrifice and ruthless triage, had been defeated by something he couldn't quite name. Not just better weapons. Not just more soldiers. Something bigger. Something that rendered everything he'd believed about strength and will and national character obsolete. Morrison called out, "Okay, gentlemen, chow's ready. Form up, and we'll get you fed." The Germans moved toward the kitchen truck like sleepwalkers. Von Schwerin went with them. The smell of real food grew stronger. His mouth watered. His hands still trembled slightly, and the taste of American chocolate lingered on his tongue like the ending of the only world he'd known. The Tiger tank's engine coughed twice, shuddered, and died. Stabsarzt Heinrich Müller didn't need to see the fuel gauge to know what had happened. He'd watched German mechanized units sputter to silence for weeks now, bleeding out from empty tanks rather than enemy fire. His field hospital wasn't a hospital. 3 tents, 2 surgical tables made from barn doors, instruments boiled in melted snow because they had no clean water. The morphine had run out March 12th. He knew the date because that was the last time he'd been able to offer a dying boy anything except his hand. The 19-year-old on the table had taken shrapnel to the femoral artery. Müller had tied off what he could reach, but the leg was already black. The amputation would happen with a wood saw. No anesthesia, just 4 orderlies to hold the boy down. "Bite this." Müller placed a leather strap between the corporal's teeth. The screaming started before the first cut. It lasted 11 minutes. Müller had learned not to count the seconds, just focus on the work, on making each stroke of the saw deliberate and clean. The boy passed out at minute 7. Blessing. The orderlies released their grip slowly, hands cramping from the effort of restraint. Müller sutured with thread salvaged from parachute silk. The hospital had received no supplies in 43 days. He'd written requisitions, filed reports, followed every procedure. The responses came back stamped with various phrases that all meant the same thing. Nothing available. His last penicillin dose had gone to an officer in February. Everyone else got wound cleaning, prayer, and time to see if their body could fight the infection alone. Most couldn't. In the corner tent, 7 men lay dying of sepsis from wounds that would have been routine in 1942. Müller checked on them twice daily, changed their dressings, and wrote careful notes about symptom progression. Because he was a doctor, and documentation was what doctors did, even when it documented failure. The jeeps arrived at 14:20 hours. American jeeps, 3 of them, marked with red crosses. Müller stood from the surgical table, hands still bloody, and waited for whatever came next. Interrogation, probably. Confiscation of his remaining supplies, 12 sulfa tablets, a half bottle of iodine, and 6 rolls of bandages so old they'd turned yellow. The first American medic through the tent flap moved with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this many times. He looked at the boy on the table, checked his pulse, examined Müller's sutures. "Good work with what you had," the medic said in careful German. "We'll take it from here." More Americans flooded in, not combat troops, medical personnel. They carried boxes. Müller watched them unpack with the numb fascination of a man observing something impossible. Plasma, bottles of it, morphine syrettes, a whole box, bandages, clean, white, rolled tight. "Captain Steinberg wants your critical cases first," the medic said. "He's setting up the surgical tent now." Müller found his voice. "Surgical tent? Mobile evac hospital. We've got everything. Lights, anesthesia, sterilization equipment. Brought 3 surgeons." The medic was already moving to the sepsis cases, checking vitals, making notes on a clipboard. "These guys need penicillin. How long have they been like this?" "We have no penicillin." The medic looked up, confused. "Since when?" "Since February." The American stared at him for 3 full seconds, processing. Then he turned and shouted toward the tent entrance. "Corporal, bring the penicillin crates. All of them." Müller followed him outside. An American surgical tent was going up in the clearing. Proper canvas, metal frames, generator already running. Through the open flap he saw surgical lamps, actual surgical lamps, bright enough to operate by, not the candles and lanterns he'd been using. A surgeon in a white coat stood scrubbing at a portable sink. Real soap, running water from a tank truck. The surgeon looked young, maybe 35, dark hair, the name Steinberg stenciled on his coat. Mahler approached slowly. "You are treating German wounded?" Steinberg glanced at him while drying his hands on a clean towel. "A clean towel? You're the German MO? Good. I need your assessment on triage priority. Who's critical?" "I don't understand. You treat enemy wounded?" The surgeon paused, hands still on the towel. "You're wounded. We're doctors. Where's the confusion? We are the enemy. Your patients now." Steinberg gestured toward the tent. "Bring me the worst cases first. I want to start with that chest wound. Looks like a sucking chest wound from here. He'll need immediate thoracotomy." The chest wound was an SS Unterscharführer. The black runes were still visible on his collar, despite the dirt and blood. He'd been screaming for 2 days, each breath a wet, rattling agony. Mahler had given him water and tried to make him comfortable because there was nothing else to do. 4 American orderlies carried the SS man into the surgical tent on a proper stretcher. Mahler followed. Steinberg was already examining the wound, his movements quick but methodical. "Tension pneumothorax, probable hemothorax. Get me a chest tube kit and prep for thoracotomy. Type and cross-match for transfusion. He's going to need at least 2 units." An American nurse, an actual surgical nurse in a clean uniform, moved efficiently around the table, laying out instruments that gleamed under the surgical lamp. Chrome instruments. Sterile. Mahler counted them reflexively. Scalpels, retractors, clamps, suction. The anesthesiologist put the SS man under with a precision that spoke of endless practice and unlimited supply. "He's under. You're good." Steinberg cut. Mahler watched the thoracotomy with the attention of a man witnessing something sacred. The American surgeon's technique was flawless. Economy of motion, minimal tissue trauma, perfect visualization. But technique wasn't what held Mahler frozen. It was the waste. Steinberg used 6 sterile drapes for 1 procedure. 6! Mahler had been reusing the same surgical drape for 3 months, boiling it between cases until the fabric was more whole than cloth. The suction catheter was disposable, used once and set aside. The gauze sponges came from a box that held dozens. The nurse pulled out handfuls, used them, discarded them. Plasma flowed into the SS man's veins from bottles marked with recent production dates. Mahler had last seen plasma in 1943. 2 units whole blood, Steinberg called out. Whole blood. They were transfusing whole blood into an SS officer. Mahler's mind did the mathematics automatically. Whole blood required refrigeration, transport, constant supply. It required a logistics network that functioned so perfectly that blood could reach a field hospital outside Cologne in May 1945. The surgery took 90 minutes. Steinberg sutured the chest cavity closed with catgut that came from a sealed package, not salvaged from veterinary supplies. When he finished, the SS man was breathing normally, his vitals stable, his color improving. "He'll need penicillin every 4 hours for the next week," Steinberg told the nurse. "And keep him on oxygen for at least 24 hours. Mahler found his voice. "You just used more medical supplies on 1 enemy soldier than I received for my entire hospital in 2 months. Steinberg was stripping off his surgical gloves. Rubber gloves, used once, thrown away. "We've got supply. Would you want me to let him die? He's SS. He's 22 years old with a chest wound." The American surgeon moved to the scrub sink, washing his hands. "Who's next?" Next was a Wehrmacht private with a compound leg fracture. Then a Luftwaffe pilot with abdominal injuries. Then another SS man with a head wound. Steinberg worked through them methodically, each patient receiving the same level of care, the same abundance of resources. By 2100 hours, the American surgical team had treated 17 German soldiers. Moeller watched all 17 procedures. He saw 37 bottles of plasma used, uncountable gauze sponges used once and discarded, whole blood transfusions for 5 critical cases, penicillin administered freely, boxes of it sitting unused, Morphine given without hesitation or rationing. Instruments cleaned and re-sterilized in an autoclave, not boiled in melted snow. The Americans set up a recovery tent with cots, clean cots, with blankets. A medical orderly checked vitals every hour through the night. Moeller sat outside the surgical tent at 0200 hours, unable to sleep. He pulled out his journal, the small leather notebook he'd kept throughout the war. He turned to the back pages where he'd been documenting losses. 203 names. Soldiers he'd lost to infections, to sepsis, to wounds that required only basic antibiotics and plasma to survive. Men who died while supplies that could have saved them sat in American depots 40 miles west. He'd done the arithmetic before, but he did it again. 203 men lost to infection. Average penicillin treatment, 10 to 14 days. He'd watched the Americans use perhaps 200 doses tonight. One American supply depot could have saved every man on his list. He thought about the 2 deserters von Schwerin had executed, shot for stealing a chicken from a civilian. The German code? Soldiers endure so civilians survive. But American soldiers didn't endure. They operated from abundance so vast that waste was routine. Morphine wasn't rationed. Plasma wasn't precious. Gauze wasn't reused. Steinberg emerged from the surgical tent, pulling off his coat. He looked tired, but satisfied. He sat down on an equipment crate near Moeller. Your German patients are stable. The SS officer will probably make it. The head wound is touch and go. Why? Moeller asked. Steinberg looked at him for a long moment. Because we're doctors, he said finally. Because when someone is wounded, we don't ask about the uniform. We ask how to stop the bleeding. Moeller let the words settle. He thought of the names in his journal, of the hands he'd held, of the screams he couldn't answer. Outside, the generators hummed, the surgical lamps glowed, and in the tent beyond the flap, a man who had been an enemy breathed more easily than Moeller had seen any of his own patients breathe in months. He closed the journal and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. The list didn't change. The numbers didn't unloose the men he'd failed to save. But for the first time that night, as he watched nurses move quietly between cots and heard the steady murmur of monitors, he allowed himself to believe that at least some of the names might stop being added. He folded his hands and, exhausted, let sleep come. Lieutenant Kurt Fearhouse stands in the processing line at POW Camp A7, outside Rems. June 1945. The war has been over for 3 weeks, but his war, the ideological one, continues inside his skull. 23 years old, 7 of those years spent in Nationalpolitische Erziehungsanstalten, the elite schools where the Reich forged its perfect specimens. He knows certain truths the way other men know their own names. Americans are mongrelized, soft, undisciplined. Their democracy is a fatal weakness. They have material wealth but no spine, no will, no capacity for sustained sacrifice. He is trained for this moment. Not the surrender, that was merely tactical, temporary. But this, the coming test of endurance in captivity. He expects starvation rations. Why wouldn't he? It's what Germany gave the Soviets. 3 million dead. The numbers are classified, but everyone knows. Fearhouse has already identified the younger prisoners who will need leadership. Pale boys from the Volkssturm, 16-year-olds who were filing requisition forms in February and holding Panzerfausts in April. They will crack first. He will organize them, maintain discipline, enforce the silent resistance that preserves dignity when everything else is gone. The smell reaches him before he understands what it means. Cooking. Actual cooking, not the acrid chemical stink of ersatz rations or the thin gruel of barley water. His stomach, which has learned not to expect anything, betrays him with a clench of animal hunger. He forces his face neutral. This is a trick, a cruelty. They will march the prisoners past the American mess, let them smell what they cannot have, break their morale before the deprivation begins. The propaganda films were very clear. Americans waste food ostentatiously while planning to starve their enemies. The line moves forward. 8,000 men, he has heard. Former Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, Luftwaffe, all mixed together now that ranks mean nothing. The Americans do not segregate by service branch, another sign of their chaotic lack of discipline. Fearhouse shuffles forward. The American guards are bored. One is reading a comic book. Captain America punching Hitler on the cover. Childish propaganda for a childish people. Another guard is trying to explain baseball to a confused Obergefreiter, using hand gestures and broken German. 9-9, you hit the ball, then you run. Verstehst du? No discipline, no snap inspections, no parade ground bearing. These are the soldiers who defeated the Wehrmacht? Yes, his honest mind whispers. These exact soldiers. He silences the thought. The line enters a vast tent. Inside, trestle tables, hundreds of them, and a serving line that runs the entire length of the space. American mess personnel in stained aprons work with assembly line efficiency. The smell is overwhelming now. Meat. Actual meat. Not the sawdust extended Dauerwurst that the Wehrmacht called sausage for the last 2 years. Fearhouse receives a metal tray. An American private, couldn't be older than 19, farm boy face, massive hands, ladles something onto it. Beef stew. 12 ounces, Fearhouse estimates automatically. Chunks of actual beef, carrots, potatoes, swimming in rich gravy. The private adds a thick slice of white bread, not Kommissbrot, that dense black bread that turned to concrete in your stomach. White bread, soft, the kind Fearhouse hasn't seen since before the war. Canned peaches. A serving of canned peaches, the syrup catching the light. The private looks at him. Coffee? Fearhouse nods, not trusting his voice. Real coffee. The smell alone is nearly obscene. Not roasted acorns or chicory root. Coffee. He moves down the line in a daze. Another American hands him a pack of cigarettes. 5 lucky strikes. Per day, the American says in mangled German. Every day. Verstehen? Fearhouse takes a seat at a table. Around him, German prisoners are silent, staring at their trays with the same incomprehension he feels. A few are weeping quietly. One Obergefreiter mumbles a prayer before eating, something Fearhouse hasn't witnessed since 1943. He begins calculating. Can't help it. It's what they taught him. Assess the enemy's capabilities through his logistics. 8,000 prisoners, 12 ounces of meat each. That's 96,000 ounces, 6,000 pounds, of meat. For one meal, in one camp. His instructors had been explicit. American industrial capacity is impressive but unfocused. Their abundance undirected by proper central planning. They waste resources on individual comfort instead of collective strength. This makes them formidable in material terms, but weak in sustained operations. Fearhouse takes a bite of the stew. It is the best thing he has tasted in 3 years. The bread is soft enough that he can tear it with his fingers. The coffee is hot and bitter and real. The peaches, he saves those for last, the way a child hoards candy. Except he is not a child. He is a lieutenant in the Luftwaffe, an ace with 11 kills, educated in the finest schools of the Reich. And he is sitting in an enemy prison camp, eating better than he has eaten since 1942. A commotion at the serving line. Fearhouse turns. A young prisoner, maybe 17, Volkssturm by the ill-fitting uniform, has approached the American serving the stew. The boy's German is hesitant, ashamed. Bitte. More? Fearhouse tenses. Asking for more. The punishment for that in Wehrmacht logistics would be immediate and harsh. Rations are rations. To ask for more is to steal from your comrades. The American looks at the boy, shrugs, ladles another full portion onto his tray. No problem, kid. We got plenty. The boy stammers thanks and retreats, holding his tray like it might evaporate. Fearhouse hears American voices from the serving area. The mess sergeant, a technical sergeant by his stripes, name tag reading Cooper, is arguing with a corporal. I'm telling you, we'll never use all this before it ages out. Quartermaster delivered 4 times what we requisitioned. Again. Cooper sounds annoyed. Not about scarcity, about abundance. Can we give the extra to the French civilians? Their town got pretty chewed up. Probably. Let me check the regs. Fearhouse sets down his fork. His hands are shaking slightly. Ages out. The food might age out. In a prison camp. For enemy soldiers. The Reich's entire economic philosophy was built on scarcity. Manage it. Ration it. Control it. Weaponize it. Sacrifice is strength. Endurance is virtue. The Volk must be hard, must be disciplined, must accept deprivation because resources are finite and enemies are infinite. But these Americans are worried about food expiring. That night, in the barracks, clean bunks, real mattresses, blankets that do not have lice, Wehrhaus lies awake. Around him, men snore with full bellies for the first time in months. Someone is crying, very quietly. Someone else is praying. He thinks about the propaganda. 7 years of it, absorbed into his bones until it became the structure of thought itself. Americans are weak. Democracy is chaos. Mongrelization destroys fighting spirit. But the Americans he encountered today were not weak. They were simply unbothered, bored even, distributing 6,000 pounds of meat to enemy prisoners with the same casual efficiency they might use to deliver mail. The guard reading Captain America comics. The mess sergeant annoyed by excess inventory. This was not the behavior of a nation straining under the demands of war. This was the behavior of a nation for whom feeding 8,000 enemy soldiers was a routine administrative task. Wehrhaus closes his eyes, sees the thunderbolt he shot down over Aachen. No, the one he thought he shot down. 200 holes from his cannon fire, and it kept flying. Just kept flying, like damage was an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. Then it returned fire, and his wingman exploded. Not shot down, deleted. He had told himself it was luck. American manufacturing meant they could absorb losses, build crude replacements, quantity over quality. But now, lying in a clean bunk after eating beef stew and white bread, Wehrhaus understands. It was not crude. It was strong, so strong that they built planes tough enough to absorb damage that would destroy anything Germany fielded, so strong that they could afford to feed their enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers, so strong that waste, aging inventory, excess capacity, giving seconds to prisoners was their primary logistical concern. Weak nations ration, weak nations hoard, weak nations punish soldiers for asking for more. Strong nations worry about food expiring. In the darkness, Wehrhaus makes a decision he does not have words for yet. Something is breaking inside the careful architecture of belief. Not broken yet, but fracturing. Hairline cracks, spreading through certainties he thought were load-bearing. He thinks about the boy who asked for seconds, the American who shrugged and gave them, the casual, almost bored generosity. Tomorrow there will be 3 more meals. He knows this now. The day after, 3 more. And the day after that, for months, probably, maybe years, until repatriation. And every one of those meals will be better than anything he received as a soldier of the Reich. This is what defeat tastes like. Sweet, abundant, impossible to deny. The American Jeep kicked up dust as it turned onto what had been Mozartstrasse. Hauptmann Wilhelm Fischer watched it approach through eyes that had learned to calculate scarcity. 6 weeks as a prisoner on work detail had sharpened the skill to instinct. Mannheim was mathematics now. 84,000 civilians remaining. Official ration, 1,200 calories daily. Actual availability, closer to 900. The numbers didn't add up to survival. Fischer, the American major's German was terrible. Thomas Henderson stepped from the Jeep, clipboard already in hand. Need your crew. Different job today. Fischer nodded, expecting the usual. Clear rubble from the main roads. Salvage intact bricks. Sort twisted rebar from actual debris. He'd been a quartermaster officer. The Americans used him as one still, just for demolition instead of supply. Not demolition, Henderson said. Distribution. Of salvage materials, Herr Major? Food. Fischer's mental calculator stuttered. Food distribution was handled by German civil authorities under American supervision. The work details didn't. Problem with the warehouse system, Henderson continued. Too slow. Got 3 trucks coming in from Stuttgart Depot at 1400 hours. Need your Germans to help unload and distribute. You know the neighborhoods. Know who needs what. Distribution to American garrison. Henderson looked at him the way Americans often did, like he'd asked whether water was wet. To civilians. German civilians. Mothers with kids under 6 get priority. Powdered milk, canned goods. You'll sort them. Fischer stood in the August heat, trying to make the equation work. The Americans were asking German prisoners to distribute American food to German civilians. The logistics made no sense. The trust made even less. Herr Major, I must clarify. You are ordering me to. I'm asking if you'll help keep kids from starving. Henderson checked his watch. Trucks arrive in 40 minutes. Yes or no? 37 members of Fisher's work detail stood in the designated square at 13:55 hours. None had eaten yet today. Their ration came at evening, a thin soup and 200 grams of bread. They waited in the shade of a gutted apartment block. The first truck arrived at 13:58 hours. Fisher watched the canvas cover peel back. Wooden crates, stenciled in English. Henderson's supply sergeant, a thick-necked man from somewhere called Ohio, started calling out contents like a perverse quartermaster drill. 50 crates powdered milk, 25 crates canned meat, 40 crates flour, 15 crates mixed vegetables. He consulted a manifest. Jesus Christ, Major, this is the third emergency requisition this week. Can you at least batch them? When kids stop being hungry, I'll batch paperwork. Fisher calculated automatically. 50 crates at roughly 40 pounds each. 2,000 pounds of powdered milk. His crew stood frozen, staring at abundance they hadn't seen in years. Don't just look at it, the sergeant barked, but he was grinning. Fisher, get your boys moving. Milk crates to the left, everything else to the right. We sort before distribution. They worked in silence. Fisher watched his men, former soldiers, current prisoners, handle American supplies with something approaching reverence. Dieter Cole, who'd been a school teacher in peacetime, actually trembled when he lifted a crate of condensed milk. The civilians began arriving at 14:30 hours. A woman, maybe 60 but looking 80, approached the distribution point Henderson had established. She carried papers: identity card, ration book, a birth certificate for her grandson. Henderson checked them quickly, nodded to Fisher. How old's the boy? 4 years, Herr Major. Her voice cracked. He has not had milk since. She didn't finish. Couldn't. Fisher took a can of condensed milk from the crate beside him. 14 ounces. He'd inventoried thousands like it in 1942, when the Wehrmacht's logistics still functioned. Before Stalingrad. Before everything. He placed it in her trembling hands. She wept. Not tears, but great, shuddering sobs that shook her whole frame. The can fell. Fisher caught it, placed it carefully in the cloth bag she carried. The boy, hollow-eyed and silent, pressed against her leg. Henderson moved to the next person in line without pausing, as though this was routine, as though making German grandmothers weep with relief over condensed milk was just another afternoon's work. By 1600 hours, Fisher had calculated the flow. Approximately 80 civilians per hour, each receiving allocation based on family size and age of children. The Americans weren't just distributing randomly, they had a system. Henderson consulted a chart showing caloric needs by age group, prioritizing nursing mothers and children under 6. It was quartermaster work, proper quartermaster work, the kind Fisher had done before the mathematics of scarcity replaced the mathematics of distribution. Fisher, Henderson waved him over. Got a problem? Fisher's stomach tightened. Problems meant reductions. Reductions meant, manifest says we're supposed to have medical supplies in this shipment. Don't see them. Can your guys check the third truck? Look for crates marked with red crosses. They found 6 crates. Vitamins, sulfa powder, bandages, a wooden box of morphine syrettes that made Fisher's hands shake when he lifted it. Heinrich Mahler would have killed for one of these boxes. Had watched boys die for want of one. That goes to the clinic on Augustanlage, Henderson said. Whatever's left of it. Dr. Braun is working out of a basement. She needs this yesterday. At 17:20 hours, Fisher watched an American soldier, PFC Marcus Washington, according to his name tape, kneel in the dust beside a 5-year-old girl. The girl's grandfather stood rigid, decades of propaganda etched in the lines of his face. The soldier held out a Hershey bar, the same kind von Schwerin's men had received in April. The girl took it. The grandfather flinched, but said nothing. The girl had already torn the wrapper open, chocolate smearing her lips. She smiled, the first smile Fisher had seen on a German child's face in months. Washington stood, nodded to the grandfather, moved on. Henderson appeared at Fisher's shoulder. Problem? No, Herr Major, I am simply observing. Observing what? Fisher gestured at the square. 3 trucks, mostly empty now, roughly 180,000 pounds of food distributed in 3 hours, to civilians who, 6 weeks ago, had been the enemy, who were, technically, still the enemy. "You are feeding a city," Fisher said, "while occupying it, while supplying your own forces, while rebuilding France, while—" He stopped. The mathematics should not work. Henderson pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Fisher. American tobacco, smooth and rich. "Mathematics works fine. We've got the production, got the ships, got the roads." He lit both cigarettes. "What we don't got is any reason to let kids starve when we can prevent it. Even enemy children?" Henderson looked at him. Really looked. The way Morrison had looked at von Schwerin when asked about feeding prisoners. "Hungry is hungry, Fisher. 5-year-olds don't have politics." The last truck departed at 18:03 hours. Fisher's work detail returned to their camp for evening ration, soup, bread, weak coffee. But Fisher stood in the emptied square, watching German mothers carry away American food to feed German children. He thought about the 2 deserters von Schwerin had executed, men who'd stolen a handful of potatoes from civilians and died for it, while the Wehrmacht code demanded soldiers starve before civilians went hungry. The Americans operated on different mathematics entirely. They fed everyone, their own soldiers, their prisoners, their enemies' civilians, and still had supply sergeants complaining about paperwork, not scarcity. Fisher had seen the manifests. Camp A7 feeding 8,000 POWs like Wehrhaus 3 times daily. Field hospitals like the one that took Mahler treating German wounded with American plasma. 63 camps across France. Thousands of distribution points across Germany. The Marshall Plan starting to move through bureaucratic channels, promising billions to rebuild the nations that had just tried to destroy them. The only way the mathematics worked was if abundance was so overwhelming that even feeding everyone, literally everyone, barely dented supply. A small girl, maybe 6, ran past him chasing a ball. She was laughing. It was a sound Mannheim hadn't heard in years. Henderson's Jeep rumbled back to life. "Fisher, you coming?" "Ja, Herr Major." He climbed in. As they drove past rubble and reconstruction, past checkpoints and camps, Henderson said quietly, "You're thinking pretty hard over there." "I am thinking about strength, Herr Major." "What about it?" "I was taught strength meant endurance, discipline, sacrifice, taking the hard path." Fisher watched the ruined city roll past. "But you have a different definition, I think." "Yeah? What's that?" "Strength is having so much you can afford to waste it on mercy." Henderson drove in silence for a block. Then, "Wouldn't call it waste." "No," Fisher agreed. "Neither would I. Not anymore." That night, in the barracks, Fisher lay awake doing mathematics. Not the mathematics of scarcity, how to stretch nothing into something, how to decide who dies so others live. Different mathematics. The mathematics of what was possible when abundance, not deprivation, was the operating principle. When strength meant you could afford to feed everyone, even enemies, even children, and still have enough left over to rebuild cities, and complain about surplus aging out. In the darkness, he heard the girl's laughter again. Simple joy, chocolate-stained and innocent. That, he thought, is what we lost. And what they had in such surplus, they gave it away to strangers. Wilhelm Fischer checked his reflection in the museum's glass door. 71 years old. The suit felt foreign after decades of casual wear, but Henderson had been clear. "This is formal, Wilhelm. Dress uniform if you still had one." He didn't. That uniform had been buried in 1946, along with what it represented. The Georgia heat was nothing like Mannheim's August swelter, but Fisher's hands still trembled as they had that day in 1945, when he'd first watched American trucks roll into the ruins. He carried a framed photograph wrapped in brown paper, the glass recently replaced, the image preserved for 33 years. "You came." Henderson stood in the museum's entrance, hair white now, the tired eyes from the photograph still sharp. They embraced like the old friends they'd become. Letters at Christmas, a visit in '63, phone calls when Fisher's wife passed. "I almost didn't," Fisher admitted in English that still carried Swabian vowels. "Speaking in front of American officers about what I learned from losing a war. What you learned from watching. Henderson guided him inside. There's a difference. The museum smelled of brass polish and old leather. Display cases held weapons Fisher had once calculated logistics for. MG-42s, Panzerfausts, a Tiger tank road wheel, relics of scarcity masquerading as strength. They passed American exhibits, Sherman tanks, the Garand rifle, a Jeep that looked identical to the one Henderson had driven in Mannheim, arguing with his supply sergeant about requisition forms while hungry children waited. "She's here," Henderson said quietly. "Anna. Flew in from Boston yesterday." Fisher stopped walking. "The girl? From the photograph?" "Dr. Kessler now, pediatric nutrition specialist. Works with WHO on childhood malnutrition in conflict zones." Henderson smiled. "She wants to meet you." The auditorium held maybe 200 people. Officers in dress uniforms, veterans with combat patches from wars Fisher barely recognized. Korea, a place called Vietnam. He spotted her in the third row. A woman in her late 30s, dark hair, a young boy beside her. The boy was perhaps 8, the same age Fisher's grandson in Heidelberg. Henderson took the podium first. The speech was practiced, official. Civil affairs operations in occupied Germany. Preventing civilian starvation. The Marshall Plan's foundations. Fisher heard the words but watched the boy in the third row, who was clearly bored, swinging his feet. "And now," Henderson said, "I'd like to introduce someone who taught me that enemies are only enemies until you feed them. Hauptmann Wilhelm Fischer, formerly of the Wehrmacht, now retired after 30 years with Care International." Fisher unwrapped the photograph at the podium. His hands had stopped shaking. The image was clear. Henderson, August 1945, organizing crates while German women queued with ration cards. In the foreground, barely visible, a small girl accepting something from an American soldier. "I was a logistics officer," Fisher began. His voice carried better than he'd expected. "I calculated tonnage and caloric requirements and distribution efficiency. I was very good at mathematics of scarcity. How to make too little go not quite far enough." A few polite chuckles. The boy in the third row had stopped swinging his feet. "In August 1945, Major Henderson requisitioned my labor company to distribute food in Mannheim. I thought it was for occupation troops. It was for civilians. Our civilians. The enemy's civilians." He paused. "I could not understand the mathematics." He described the trucks from Stuttgart, the powdered milk, the canned meat, the medical supplies. The supply sergeant complaining about paperwork, not scarcity. "But what I could not calculate," Fisher said, "was this." He held up the photograph so the audience could see. "This is PFC Marcus Washington. He gave a 5-year-old German girl a piece of his chocolate ration. The girl's grandfather, you cannot see him in the photo, was horrified. Years of propaganda had taught him certain things about race, about hierarchy, about who deserved what." Fisher's throat tightened. But the girl did not know propaganda. She only knew a man was offering her something sweet. Dr. Anna Kessler was crying silently in the third row. Her son watched her, confused. "I spent the war calculating how to stretch insufficient resources across too many needs. I watched good doctors like Heinrich Moeller amputate without anesthesia because we had no morphine. I knew officers like Friedrich von Schwerin who executed their own men for stealing food to survive. I saw pilots like Kurt Vierhaus taught that democracy made nations weak." He set the photograph on the podium. "And then I watched America feed 8,000 German prisoners 3 meals daily and worry the food might expire before they could use it. I watched American surgeons use plasma and penicillin to save SS officers' lives. I watched Major Henderson argue with his quartermaster for more milk because German children were malnourished." The auditorium was silent, except for the air conditioning's hum. "I was taught strength meant sacrifice, that power came from making difficult choices about who deserves to survive, that feeding your enemy was waste." Fisher looked directly at Henderson. "But you won the war with weapons, and won the peace with food, with medicine, with the radical idea that hungry children have no nationality." He gestured to Anna Kessler. "That 5-year-old girl became Dr. Anna Kessler. She has spent 15 years treating malnourished children in refugee camps, in Bangladesh, In Cambodia, in places where war creates the mathematics of scarcity I once knew too well." He paused. "She named her first son Thomas, after this man, who gave her chocolate when she was hungry and did not see an enemy. Only a child." Anna stood. The boy, Thomas, stood with her, still confused but mimicking his mother's formality. "For 33 years, Fisher continued, I have tried to repay what I learned in Mannheim, that abundance shared creates more security than scarcity hoarded, that feeding people, all people, is not weakness disguised as mercy, it is the only real strength." His voice was steady now, the mathematics finally clear. "You did not win because you were cruel more efficiently than we were. You won because you could afford to be kind and chose to be. That choice, repeated millions of times, systematized, made routine, that changed everything." He picked up the photograph. "This moment, PFC Washington and a hungry girl. This is why you won. Not the tanks or planes or ships, though you had those. You won because strength so overwhelming it can afford mercy is the only strength worth having." The applause started slowly, then built. Fisher looked at the audience through tears he hadn't expected. Officers who'd fought in wars he'd never studied, veterans who'd seen things he could only imagine, all of them standing. Anna Kessler walked to the podium. She embraced him without speaking, then stepped to the microphone. "I don't remember being hungry," she said quietly, "but my mother told me stories. She said the Americans came, and the dying stopped." She touched the photograph. "Herr Fisher helped distribute the food that saved us. He made lists, organized queues, calculated rations. He made mercy efficient." She looked at her son. "Thomas, come here." The boy approached uncertainly. Anna guided his hand to touch the photograph's frame. "This man," she pointed to the soldier, "gave me chocolate when I was your age. And this man," she gestured to Fisher, "helped feed a whole city. They didn't have to. We'd just lost a war we started, but they chose to anyway." Thomas studied the photograph with 8-year-old seriousness. "Why?" he asked. Fisher knelt down so they were eye level. The question children asked, the question that mattered. "Because," Fisher said, "your mother was hungry, and they had food, and that was enough reason." Thomas nodded slowly, processing. "That's the whole story?" he asked. Fisher smiled. "That's the whole story." The museum hung the photograph beside a display on civil affairs operations. The placard read, "PFC Marcus Washington shares rations with German civilian, Mannheim, August 1945. Photographed by Major Thomas Henderson." At the reception afterward, Fisher stood with Henderson and Anna, watching Thomas examine a Sherman tank with appropriate reverence. "He'll remember this day," Anna said. "Not the speeches, the photograph, the story." "Good," Henderson replied. "That's the point." Fisher thought about all the calculations he'd made. Tonnage and calories and distribution matrices, the mathematics of scarcity that had defined his war. And he thought about the mathematics of abundance that had defined his peace, the care packages to Korea, the refugee feeding programs in Bangladesh, the nutrition protocols for emergency relief, all of it based on what he'd learned in Mannheim, that having enough to share wasn't waste, it was victory. "I should have brought more photographs," Fisher said, "of the work, the camps, the distributions." "No," Anna touched his arm. "One is enough. One perfect moment tells the whole story." She was right. The ice cream trucks at POW camps, the field hospitals treating enemies, the mess halls serving seconds, all of it was in this single image. A soldier sharing chocolate with a hungry child. Thomas ran back to them, excited. "Grandpa Henderson, did you really drive a Jeep in the war?" Henderson laughed. "I did. Want to see one?" As they walked to the vehicle exhibits, Fisher stayed behind with the photograph. He studied it one more time. PFC Washington kneeling, the girl reaching, Henderson in the background organizing crates. The moment when scarcity's mathematics finally broke, when abundance proved it could afford mercy, when feeding enemies' children became the only calculation that mattered. Fisher turned away from the display. Outside, Georgia's heat waited, and tomorrow, a flight back to Heidelberg, back to retirement, back to grandchildren who would never know hunger, because in 1945, Americans had chosen to share their rations because the enemy's civilians had none left, and that had been reason enough.